would be an English language learner. The graduation rates aren't so great today. And then when we talk about all students being held to the same standard, we don't want it any different. You know, we want high standards for all students. We want them, but they also have to have the tools to meet those standards, right? You know, if you have students who require remediation because maybe they didn't have many books at home, they don't have access to computers, these are actual student homes in the colonials. These kids who go to these, who live in these homes and go to school are held to the very same standards that the kids in Alamo Heights, the kids in Chavano Park, all of those kids are held to the same standards. And what our current case is, in our case right now, is pretty close to the one that Northside has brought, except we focused on those kids who are hurting the worst. We focused on the lowest wealth districts, and we focused on the low-income and ELL students. So we've argued not just that schools are inadequately funded, but that funding for these two student groups who are struggling the most is arbitrary and inadequate. The formula that was applied to fund the education of English language learner and low-income students was set in 1984, I believe. 1984, and it hasn't changed all of these years. And even then, the studies by the state showed that it should be at 40%, and they arbitrarily set it down for low income at 20%. They set the extra funds for English language learners at 10%. And what ends up happening is then you're forcing districts, and we showed this. This was very similar to the case that we recently brought in Colorado on behalf of English language learner and low-income students. And when we were successful, we won. We proved that that system was inadequate. But what ends up happening is you end up having to rob Peter to pay Paul. You're forcing districts to try and make decisions between, okay, well, do we provide this enrichment to these kids so that they can really meet their true potential, or do we provide acceleration programs or remediation programs for this other group of students? And when we look, because we need to focus on outputs in this case. The last time we did focus on it, but we didn't think that the Supreme Court was going to be so bad in its analysis showing, because it was the first year of tax. So we had the 2004, this is in math, so if you look at the 2004 performance results, that's essentially what was the record. We have 40% of the kids who are economically disadvantaged not meeting the standard. And you can say, wow, all the way fast forward to 2011, and they're really meeting those standards. We know that there's a lot of teaching to the test. I even went and did a career day at an elementary, and I was, I was perplexed at what I saw, because it was like, reach for the star, and they were talking about the new star, and I was like, that's what their whole education, all these kids in this school have these t-shirts because their education was all about this test. But, so it's going to be a kind of difficult case when you look at these outputs, because it looks like the gaps have closed somewhat, although they're pretty substantial between some of the groups there. In science, they're even bigger, all the way through 2011. But the problem is that we now have to be ready for college. It's not meeting some tax scores. I'm not sure how many of you have taken the tax. I know my daughter takes the tax and she's laughed at it. She's got her mama's genes, and she does well, but she's probably missed this many questions throughout the whole time that she's been testing since the 3rd grade. She's now in the 7th grade. But now we have to be ready for college. So we're going to have the STAR test, right? We call it the Death Star. And because it's more high-stakes testing, you're going to go from 4 exit tests in high school to 12. You're going to go from never being tied to the grades. You might have heard that the commissioner said that he's not going to enforce the 15% standard, and that might be true, but that's true for this year. What happens next year, who knows? But even if you don't tie the grades, there's still huge problems, because everybody was celebrating. Yeah, that's a great job, Commissioner, way to go. But there's still minimum scores on these individual tests. that they're going to have to meet. They don't know exactly what those scores are. I'm not sure if you found out just yet, Dr. Folks.
We were supposed to know at the end of February, and they yet to tell us.
And here we are almost at the end of March, and they're supposed to be taking the test next week.
Right.
They don't know what score they have to get, you know, and I've heard stories about teachers saying, you know, you got to get 80% or you're not going to get any credit for this, and they don't even know. And then, you know, it's going to be tied to diploma requirements. So if you were to recommend a high school diploma, then you're going to have to meet a certain score even above the minimum score. Then you're going to have to meet a cumulative score. So in Algebra 1, Algebra 2, you're going to have to meet a minimum cumulative score in that also. And what's even worse, and I won't get too much into STAR because we can just go on, is that you're not going to find out exactly what your score is, particularly with the end of course exams in the high school, until the first week in June. When are you going to graduate? And if you fail, if you don't get that minimum score, you're supposed to be allowed to retake. You won't know if you even have to go to summer school. And now with the cuts, there's a lot of schools that aren't even going to be able to afford summer school for all of these kids who are going to require the remediation. They say, well, don't worry about it. You can take it during the next testing. So into the next year, you would end up you're already taking maybe Algebra 1 because you passed the class. Now you're taking Algebra 2. But now you're going to have to go back and take the Algebra 1 test sometime in around November. This makes absolutely no sense. And this is the way the testing system has strangled the system. And then, like I said, you know, with respect to the dollars, we look at Bexar County. Here's a snapshot of Bexar County. And this was just based on the estimates after the last legislation came out. You have a South Side taxing at $1.17. The state cut $305 from them, even with these rising standards, and they get $5,341, the South Side kids. You go all the way to North Side, same standards, remember, they have the same standards to meet. They're taxing at $1.04, and they get almost $1,000 more per student. 13 cents less. Imagine if they came to you and said, hey, we're going to give you a 13-cent cut on your property taxes. Be ecstatic. And that's what ends up happening here. Essentially, Alamo Heights has given a 13-cent tax break and only $6,200. And I'm not going to say that Alamo Heights has sufficient funds here, you know, at $6,200, because that's highly endowed, especially with the new STAR. And not only do we have the new STAR, but like I said, you're going to have to be ready for college. So you saw the tax scores, right? Well, let's see how it translates to the state's definition, which has already been watered down, I can tell you, on ready for college. The state, 52% are college ready on English and math according to the tax test score. 1/2 of the students are not ready. 60% almost of Latino students are not ready for college at the watered down Texas Education Agency standard. Because then when you look at the far right column, and you look at ACT, SAT scores, right? This is what the College Board says. If you're going to be college ready, this is what you got to score. 3 out of 4 kids in the state are not college ready. 87% of Latinos, 92% of African Americans. They don't report the data on economically disadvantaged ELL, at least the report that I've looked at. And so that's where we're at now. Why are we suing? Why not? We have no other recourse. We're not going to win in the legislature. The legislature has never changed the system without having a gun to its head from the courts. Never. They never have, and they might well as never will, unless you all take that political action that you need to and start going to the polls and you start going to the Capitol and you get your friends and everybody involved. And I just want to close that, you know, this isn't just a Bexar County thing. It's in Central Texas where you have these huge gaps. It's in Harris County where we have huge gaps. It's in the Dallas area where you have huge gaps. It's in the Panhandle. But it's not very difficult. People will say that it's very complex. School finance is very complex. It's very difficult. But it's not really. If you have a pie and you need to divide it 8 ways equally, it's pretty easy, right? But then once you say, well, wait a second, why don't you give this person a bigger piece? Now why don't you give this person a bigger piece too? Now it's pretty hard to try and divide that pie equally, obviously. And to try and fix the system, it's not rocket science. These are 5 simple steps. You close the equity gap up so we don't bring anybody down necessarily, because we don't want to have to do that. We provide meaningful opportunities to English language learners by increasing the bilingual education weight. And you're not going to bankrupt the system either by focusing on those students who are most at need. And by increasing the weights for English language learner and at-risk youth or low-income youth, Northside, Dallas, Highland Park less, but Alamo Heights, all of those have fairly significant English language learner or low-income students. For Alamo Heights, it's around 25–30%, but that's still, the extra dollars to help those students out most in need. To provide some facilities funding, which is incredibly inequitable, much more inequitable than the instruction piece of this, and then provide elasticity for changing circumstances so we're not bound to a system. So, an investment of education dollars and an investment in the future of Texas. We are the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, but we care about all kids in Texas. It's not just Mexican Americans who are being held to inequality in its schools. Same goes for many other kids across Texas, and we want to ensure that they have the best opportunity to fulfill their own potential. Thank you.
We will now hear from Mr. Weeks about State of Texas schools and how you can become involved.
Thank you. I wish I had been here to hear Dr. Folks, because that would get me all warmed up and all revved up and my face be red here, but I know he educated and you had a great presentation on a lot of the details around this, and I think after what you've heard, you could probably just right now just shake your fist against the darkness and say, this is a mess. It's a mess from multiple directions. Finance directions, educational philosophy, just all sorts of places you could say it's a mess. But I'm I think an unbreakably hopeful person, which I taught for 15 years. When you teach, you have to be hopeful. And fortunately, I've had enough experiences where I've seen pretty messy situations actually something good happen. And so I really believe we can, and we really don't have any choice. We can't shake our fists at the darkness on this. We've got to make progress on multiple fronts. And it takes multiple people doing multiple strategies to force this thing back. But it does come down to, we've got approximately 180 people sitting in that big stone building in Austin that are making very, very key decisions about millions of children and millions of citizens about our future. And whatever input they get, the quality of it is, that's what comes out in their decisions. And it's funny, I worked on an issue in the 2009 legislative session, and I really came away kind of scared. Because that commercial about the Holiday Inn Express, I slept at a Holiday Inn. You felt like some of the experts they were bringing in, they'd gone out to the corner and said, hey, does anybody know anything about finance here? And could you come on in here? We got a discussion. And it's some of the, sometimes you felt like that their input really was not very good, or the input was very, very slanted. Certain groups, certain people just flooded the place with their input, and other people, like you, were not in there with your input. So I came away in one sense scared, but also kind of hopeful, because I said, I was able to get in there and actually have some really good input into that session on a couple of bills. And it's amazing I got in the door, but I did. And, we really can't influence those people. We have to. Now, we've got a primary election coming up, May 29th, if it's May 29th or June 29th, whatever, Christmas, sometime we're going to have a primary election, But we're going to have one. And 2 years ago, most of us slept through. How many voted in a primary election 2 years ago? Raise your hand. Okay, well, you guys, that's an unusually high percentage here. But we're talking like, what, 6, 7%, I mean, we're talking really low percentage of voters participating in primaries, except one group really organized for the primaries 2 years ago. And that was a group that wanted to make government smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. To cut and cut and cut and cut. And they organized, and you know what? Because primaries are oftentimes won by even hundreds of votes. They got a whole slew of people into the legislature. And that got us into a world of trouble with these budget cuts. So, simple strategy, we've got to get good people who believe in kids and public education back in the legislature. And it's going to take us a couple of sessions to do it. It's not just one session, it's going to take us a couple of sessions. I don't care what party they're from, but we've got to get people that really understand the kind of things these guys have talked about already tonight, and who really believe in kids, and are not in there just to cut government. You would not believe how unqualified some of the people that got elected this last time were. Nice people, but I mean, there were representatives walking in literally, now how many months am I here? I thought this was for 2 months. Now how much do I get paid for this? I mean, there were a couple people saying, I need to go home, my job's back there. I didn't know this was going to be 4 or 5 months. I thought it was here for, I mean, they didn't know anything. They've been put up to this job. It's kind of like being in the 1800s, you know, something like that. But we've got to get good qualified people back in there. So this weekend, Saturday, we're having a rally in Austin. And I've had people say, well, why have a rally? It's just getting a lot of people together, and it's just noise. But you know what? This rally, doing these things, this is about focus. People have lots of things to focus on. And we are having a rally in order to focus people. And already we've had a week of media focus around the state on education cuts. And it's been because we're having this rally, because groups have had press conferences, because it just kind of has brought everything focused. In a lot of the paper, it probably wouldn't have been there otherwise. I mean, there have been some, but not the focus that's there right now. And so we're having this rally because we want people to be thinking about their schools and what's being done to them from now to the primary on May 29th. And we want people asking hard questions. You know, people running for office will say they love babies and public schools. You know, they'll say, except there's one legislator will say, I hate public schools, no matter what. But you know, most of them will say that. But they won't say what it means specifically. So we're teaching people specific questions to ask them. Questions like, what will you do to restore the $5.4 billion cut in the last session? What will you do to make sure that growth, 80,000 students a year approximately, is funded? What will you do to make sure our kids are not over-tested, that they actually have time to learn? Questions like those. We're teaching simple questions, and people are going around. I'm seeing it on Facebook, I'm getting emails. People are going around the state asking those kind of questions. And it's going to get the truth out of people, and then they can be voted for yes or no based on what they really are going to do to education. And I swear, if we leave it the way it is right now, we will see how many, let's take a bet how many billions we're going to see cut next January, public education. But it's going to be severe because it's really, in some ways, it's a worse situation than we just got through. Because not only do we have the education, not only do we have a structural deficit that's adding up, you know, $5 billion each year, but we also have some, you know, a very messy situation with healthcare. And then they're, you know, you're already hearing they're adding transportation and water on top of that. So there's going to be a lot of things to compete for education dollars. We've got to get people in there that will stand up for school. So that's why we're doing a rally this Saturday. And that's why, you know, I'm making an advertisement right now, but that's why we need you up in Austin and bringing people. We've got a lot of UT students who are coming down. You know, last time we did this last year, we had very few UT students. I think they've woken up after they saw their tuition bills and their financial aid cut and their programs and courses cut. Just this last Tuesday, not to mention any groups, but the Texas Public Policy Foundation, or TPP.
Texas Public Policy Foundation.
Texas Public Policy, TPPF. And their cousins, the Americans for Prosperity and all the other groups that live in that world, But they had a press conference on Tuesday and basically laid out their agenda, what they're going to push for. And it's just cut, cut, cut. And we're going to see hundreds of millions out of higher ed if those people have their way. And so we've got to be there and Saturday really, really focus people around the state about these primaries coming up. 130 out of 150 House seats will be decided in the primary. Can't wait till the general election. The time's now, but the good news is that those are decided by small numbers of votes. If we can get it in there. Guess how many, what the percentage of teachers that vote is? How many teachers vote? What percentage? Somebody, 12% low. Well, I'll give them a break. Yes?
70?
I, 30%. 30% of teachers. Can you imagine if 60% of teachers voted? We wouldn't be sitting here. We can just get 60%. Somebody was telling me about it. One of the districts in Harris County, the median voting age in the last election was 67. What does that tell you? We're the young people. Yeah. So, you know, it's, so we really can change this. We can get out and vote. We can rally. We can get people focused. But that's what we have to do. And I appreciate being here tonight. I know Safe Texas School is something we started a year ago, and we're just trying to provide those materials. We're working in partnership with all the various teacher associations, groups. I mean, everybody's trying to work on this. But it's all about the vote right now. So I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Are we taking any questions? Okay. Are there any questions before you left? Great. Questions, thoughts, inspirations? Okay. Are you going to be there Saturday? Yes. Okay. Let me hear. Everybody's going to be there. Stand up. Who's going to be there on Saturday? Who knows who's going to be there? One of our main speakers right here. These guys right there. Thank you very much.
Could I add just one comment to what he said? He asked the question, how much is going to be cut out of education? I was in a meeting in Austin just yesterday, and sales tax collections are up. You know, the economy is improving. The rainy day fund is increasing some because of the Eagle Shale Forward and some other things. But the bottom line of what they told us, very simply, is any increases in revenue is going to have to go to pay for Medicaid, because they deferred the funding of Medicaid in the last legislative session. So they have a $4.8 billion deficit just to fund Medicaid when they walk in the door. And now they're saying that could be even as high as, $8 to $10 billion. New money is going to go in.